You are listening to Seeking the Hidden Thing with Kryptos. Welcome, everyone, to another episode of Seeking the Hidden Thing. I have back again Athenian Stranger, and we are part 3 in our series on Hans George Gadamer's Truth and Method. Welcome, Athenian.
Thank you so much for having me again. I'm really enjoying these.
And thank you for making some time on Thanksgiving morning. I did Thanksgiving a month ago, so it's, that's the way it goes. But anyway, so we're, just unceremoniously, let's just kind of dive in, because if we start rehashing what we did before, we'll end up with another whole discussion. But
right,
we're beginning the Gadamer in this next section, first 100 pages or so, up until chapter 2, which begins on page 100, it will work through a series of concepts in the effort to establish a ground for truth, or the foundations for a ground for truth that is not based on method, because that's how we began the problem of method. And so now we're going to begin with some different concepts. We're going to begin with the concept, basically like section B, you said, like the headings, sort of tell you what's going on, the guiding concepts of humanism. So in a sense, Gadamer is going to be presenting humanism in this sense as a response, shall we say, probably the best word would be scientism, I would think. Yeah. And that would be the way to go. And so he has sort of closed the door, saying that scientism, method, and empirical observation cannot lead you to the truth, can give you no knowledge of the truth. They can provide a certain type of knowing, but it's always particular, and it has no meaning to it in that regard. And so you cannot get access to the truth. In a sense, he even argues that the methodology actually closes you off from the truth. And so now we begin the process of saying, well, then, if science cannot give us truth, what can? And so we begin with this notion. He's going to lay a series of concepts out of which we will begin to rebuild this notion of truth. And he's trying to do it, again, as we said last time, from the bottom up. So he's not going back to say something like, "Thus says the Lord," but he's looking to rebuild a grounded notion of truth from the ground up. Now, in the end, I think he's probably not successful, but for a Christian who has a top-down understanding of truth, all of the concepts that we're going to get, I think, become very, very helpful, but they will also be very, very challenging, because they will challenge how you understand things like the Bible and what the Bible is as a book that way, in a sense, and what it means and so forth for truth and everything. And so in that regard, prepare to have maybe some of your world being rocked. But again, let's just dive in. Bildung, culture.
Yeah. One of the ways that I would phrase it is, this with books like this that are, first of all, I mean, we're talking 500 or 600 pages. And second of all, it's also very dense, particularly the opening, right? That's what we were emphasizing last time, is because there's so much at issue, right? And so it's always helpful for people to sort of, whenever they're taking on tasks like this, to really kind of have a broad understanding of remembering what's at issue. And what he has done is he's distinguish between the natural things and then the human things. And the natural things have the natural sciences, and they have these ways of providing us with truth about things. But the question was, what about the human things? And in particular, things like that we read, right? This is the whole point of hermeneutics itself. I mean, it arises, well, it's not so much that it arises from, but it really gains ground and sort of takes on a life of its own with respect to understanding the Bible, right? How do we interpret the Bible? And
What is the Bible?
and just the fact that just the word itself, interpretation, means that, or well, it suggests or implies that knowing what the author intends is not of necessity uh, one of immediacy. In other words, it might be mediated, right? In other words, there might be contributing factors on our end that interfere with the understanding of what the author is trying to get across. And that's what Gadamer is doing in the build-up here, these 100 pages or so of this first part. And that's why it's so rich in history, is because he's telling us about all of the different ways in which this has happened. And most important, at least as I understand it, uh, and it seems to be the case for Gadamer as well, is this notion of Bildung, which can often be translated as culture. Now, there is a word for culture in German that is culture, right, with a K. But Bildung in particular is going to be helpful here. But the whole
Because of the
point,
history of the word, it becomes more significant because of its origin with build formation.
exactly, yeah. The ung part or dung part in German, when you see that at the end of a word, usually that's the first indication you're dealing with a noun. Now, Bildung, the build part, that can mean a number of different things. It can mean something as simple as a painting, or an image or something like that, right? And that's what he's going to trace. And I'm still looking into it. I got to find. He points out. He says, luckily there's been some work done on this word Bildung, so that we don't have to reinvent that wheel too. Where he talks about how it owes its origin in Christian mysticism in a sense, because of you're carrying the image of Christ with you to form yourself, in other words, in that. And it's a PhD that he cites that's in German. And I still have not, I haven't had a chance to see if, to get a hold of it. It's
When you're
difficult to get
citing
a hold of
PhD
PhDs.
theses in German, you know that you're like, his level of research sort of is beyond mine.
Yeah. But the whole point, again, sort of broad scale, is that, and he's going to bring that. We're going to see this almost immediately with these two sections. There's Bildung, and then there's the common sense, communist census that he's going to talk about, because they segue directly into the other. All of this is a segue and a lead up to Immanuel Kant, is where he's going. But we're going to find that he gets to Kant, though, through Hegel, which is interesting, but that's also important, because what Gadamer is showing us is that we can't just sort of even begin from it. It's true that we're going from the ground up, but we go from the ground up by first making sure we understand where we are at, right? And often where we are at is with these later thinkers, right? Because they constitute so much of what we take for granted. And he has just such an amazing phrase that he uses here, that I think in this section on Bildung, that is so helpful for the listeners or anyone taking on this task, because it really nails so very much of what the problem ultimately is, really with everything, but especially with this task of hermeneutics, or interpreting things. And what he says is, key concepts and words, which we still use, acquired their special stamp then. Now, the then that he's talking about is what he refers to as the age of Goethe, the 18th century. And he says, and now this is what I love, the way that he phrases this. He says, if we are not to be swept along by language, but instead to strive for a reasoned historical self-understanding, he says, we must face a whole host of questions about verbal and conceptual history. What he's saying there is that the very words we use, like Bildung, culture, worldview, values, all these kinds of stuff. I mean, he lists them for us. He says that we use these words as concepts. Now, we have to understand what's so important about concept. concepts are what we take to be sort of the end of the line, something like love, right, or the good, or beauty. These are all fundamental concepts that are the answers to the strings of questions that we ask about everything. And he says concepts such as, and he puts all these words are going to be in parentheses, because what he's telling us is that these are words that are conceptual, and we use them casually and we don't fully understand what they mean. So art, history, the creative, worldview, experience, genius, external world, interiority, expression, style, symbol, all of these words. And he says they contain a wealth of history. And that really helps people to understand why the task that he is up to is so important to us, because he's saying, look, he says, we can't, I want to get us into all of this, but unless and until people understand that these very words that we use, we don't fully understand them, then we're not going to really be able to get anywhere. We're going to be, as he says, carried along, swept along by mere language, right?
Well,
so,
and he's laying the groundwork for his, as you say, for his discussion of Kant, but also the counter to nominalism, right? And so, it's the contrast to method as the ground of truth is, of course, intuition. So the argument that he's making is a philosophical argument for intuition as the ground of truth. And the problem of nominalism is that you get trapped in a moment where your experience is completely isolated, that it's just a moment in time, it's connected to nothing. And what Gadamer is making the case here, and it begins right here at the beginning, is that the very words you use have a history. And so just your ability to talk about the concepts that we're about to talk about are rooted in a history of words. And so he says, you have to simply accept the fact that the words that you're using have a past, and that you don't have to reinvent all the meanings for the words that you use, which on the face of it seems obvious, but is also at the same time very, very important for Gadamer, because the question then becomes, well, where did you get all of those meanings from for these words? Well, you could say history is one way, but that's where the sense of Bildung comes in, is that you absorb them in your culture. And this is where the importance on a page later, when he's talking about form, and this, I think, why Bildung as opposed to culture is the word that he chooses. Again, it's significant. Why not just use the word culture with a K, right? Well, because of the history of the word Bildung. It has, form, formation. So this idea that you're being formed by your own history and your own culture, your own, during the Sitzimleben, your own situation in life, right? And then he's again trying to counter sort of nominalism. So he's asking, what is it that ties my individual experience to a larger reality? And, we could talk about this larger reality as truth, but he just begins, he's not even associating it with truth, but just he calls it the universal, but we have to be careful, because it's not like a rational, like the modernist notion of universal. It's more the idea of something larger than myself that binds my experience to a reality greater than me, right? And that's sort of Gadamer's use of universal. It's not a timeless, rational statement that is true in the same way, always, in every time, every situation, irregardless of place or history. That's not what Gadamer means when he talks about universal. When he's talking about universal, he's talking about an experience that transcends myself and binds me to something greater than myself.
Yeah, this gets to the larger project of the entire work. That's again, this is something that's really helpful for your listeners when they're sort of asking themselves, why are these two guys talking about this 600-page book, and they're talking about it for so long. Well, What Gadamer is concerned with, as he's told us sort of in the intro, is this question of the so-called ancients and the moderns. And this is what's going to, and let me just sort of simply say, because this will directly address this issue of, nominalism is correct, but the way that Gadamer describes it in this text much later, which is just beautiful, is he calls it hermeneutical nihilism.
Yes.
Now, this is what he says, because this is what people need to understand about the so-called quarrel of the ancients and the moderns. What happens is that the new learning that comes into the West that they didn't know existed with the new texts and everything like that causes a very, very serious question regarding how to move forward, because we didn't know these things, and they might be able to provide us with ways forward that the so-called ancients didn't know, because we've gained our own knowledge in the interim. And this is what he says. He says, only after the failure of the naive historicism of the very century of historicism, now he's already told us that's the 19th century, that's the rise of so-called everything so historical. What he says, does it become clear that the contrast between the unhistorical dogmatic, in other words, taking no account for history, and the historical, and then he says also between tradition and historical science, and he says also between ancient and modern, he says is not absolute. And he says the famous quarrel of the ancients and the moderns ceases to pose real alternatives. Now, what that means is that's the ultimate fusion that of the horizons that he's talking about. In other words, the claim that gets made is that our historical situation is so new that we can't really have any significant access to ancient texts. And what Gadamer is saying, this brings in his notion of the universal, what he's going to refer to as universal hermeneutic. And exactly as Kryptos said, it's not universals in the sense of metaphysical. What he's meaning is that there is a hermeneutic that can actually bind us in our historical situation today with all of these ancient texts, so that we don't end up in the situation of exactly what Derrida says when Derrida claims that reading is really writing. In other words, there's no text, it's what you make of it. Kryptos and I were attacked by some academic at one point talking about Gadamer, and she said something to the effect of, I much more prefer Derrida. Well, of course you do, because Derrida means Derrida opens the door so that you can make any text say whatever you want. This is very similar to Lacan. Lacan famously says in an interview, he says the text just emanates from within you. So in other words, there's no such thing as an author, an author's intention. There is only what we make of it from our current historical situation, because we can't escape it. And what Gadamer, and that's the question of the ancients and the moderns. And what Gadamer is saying is, yes, that is an issue, but it's not fundamental in the sense that we can't actually come across that bridge, right? So we can access, there is a universal way to be able to read the ancient texts with a hermeneutic, a universal hermeneutic. And again, I have to emphasize, he's not talking about universals in the sense of metaphysics or anything. He's talking about his method, right? That the whole point of the book is about his method of how to read these books, so that you can fuse, on the one hand, our historical circumstances with the intention of an ancient author, which, as again, to just really emphasize, the whole concept of hermeneutics arose with how are we to interpret the Bible, right? How are we to do that?
That's right.
So yes, so I mean that's what it's and well, go ahead, please.
I was going to say, and he does, like in this opening section, the first 100 pages up till chapter 2, he addresses that issue specifically as you get through the concepts, this idea that, and he'll do that through the process of genius, that the argument that really the only thing that matters is my encounter with the work, and that the creative process is ongoing, but really the work is what I make of it, and my continuing unfolding within myself of my experience of the work. And Gadamer, will directly challenge that, to say that if you do that, that's where that quote of nihilism comes in. That it's right in that section. And so he says basically it just results in nihilism. Everybody is stuck basically in their, as an isolated monad, with their own unique experience of the world, completely disconnected from everyone else. And I think in the sense, what Gadamer's saying, he says that type of argument defies our experience of the world. Because I think on an experiential level, we communicate. And so what he's doing, he's asking, well, how is it that we communicate? He says, we're not all just locked solipsistically into our own, frame, and we don't, communicate with anybody. We do communicate with people, and meaning does get transferred. So how does this happen? Right. And so,
Yeah.
so he's asking, so what is this? When he talks about the universal, he says, what is this larger thing that operates between us that allows us to communicate meaning from one to the other?
Right. And that's so important what you just pointed out there. And this is how I would phrase it. Remember how I mentioned that, just the word itself, interpretation, implies or suggests that knowing what an author intends with his writing is not always immediately clear. It might be somehow mediated or something by the things of our glasses, we could say, might be a little bit blurry to be able to see what he's wanting to get to us. But what Gadamer means with this universal hermeneutic is he's saying, look, all of us in our everyday lives, when people talk to us, we assume that there is a meaning, an intention, a purpose for why it is that they're talking to us. That's commonsensical. Why should it be any differently? Why should it be any differently with the text of an author just because they wrote a long time ago, right? And so it's that common sense approach that I think, and that, by the way, I mean, it's the whole point of the third.
That's the next concept after Bildung is sensus communis.
Exactly, the common sense. But because here's the key, because again, it's these sort of ancients and the moderns, and he's going to reference Vico of all people, because in a particular book that Vico writes, where Vico is explicitly talking about the question of the ancients and the moderns. I mean, that's how well read Gadamer is in all this. That's why it's so fun to just read Gadamer.
Oh yeah.
Regardless of whether one agrees with it or not, you're going to learn so much. It's just unreal.
Yeah.
Go ahead. No,
I was going to say, yeah, finish your thought, Athenian, then we'll move on.
No, I was just going to say that this is always the issue, even in our common sense everyday dealings with people. We are living in a particular moment. We encounter something, either what someone says or a speech that's given, a political speech, for instance, right? We want to know what the meaning is. And so we have possibilities going forward, right, based upon our interpretation of these things. Now, what is the primary content of those possibilities moving forward? Well, that's going to always be primarily from the tradition that we are from. That's what's going to inform the interpretations that we make of all kinds of things. Now, that's one issue. But the other issue about us simply being human is that we do, in fact, we can't even truly explain it, but there is something about us that also experiences this call of conscience, right? So that might lead us to move with whatever the content of the past is going forward into the future. And it's going to be, so it's that kind of openness to the call of conscience that we have for going forward, as well as how our own past is so fundamentally informed by the tradition. That coming together of these things is essentially going to be really everything of what Gadamer is just trying to get across to his readers, to be able to bridge the gap of what the fashionable thing today is to say, with all the so-called post-structuralist and deconstructions, to say that no, the text has no meaning, right? The text has no meaning, and it's always ironic because they're telling us that in a text, right? They tell us that in a text, that no text has any meaning or anything.
Yeah,
So
you're writing something to tell me that I can't understand what you're writing. Which,
right,
yeah, exactly.
yeah,
So what Gadamer does is he argue, so he separates out Bildung, which is sort of like form, or build is form, from the word like formation, formerung, right? And so he says that Bildung eventually wins out over form, but he goes back to this. He said the rise of the word Bildung, this is on page 11, evokes the ancient mystical tradition according to which man carries in his soul the image of God after whom he is fashioned, and which man must cultivate within himself. So there's this idea that there's something. Now it's interesting that he's working from the bottom up, but he drops these sort of notions. He says, yeah, like this is how we expressed it up until the modern period, is that we were created in God's image, and this thus bind us together. And everybody kind of understood this. This was, and so it was just natural that this word developed. And so you have to understand that people understood that we had a human nature that we shared. And he just basically drops it, and he doesn't argue it. He just asserts it. We have a human nature, and and this binds us together. And so he's working in contra to the nominalists who would argue that we don't. But Gadamer doesn't even, he basically says this idea is so self-evident in a sense that we really don't even need to argue it. It's the basis of how we understand everything. So then he says, this notion of Bildung, of culture, has this idea of being form, but he then goes on the same page to say Bildung as such cannot be a goal. It cannot as such be sought except in the reflective thematic of the educator. In having no goals outside itself, the concept of Bildung transcends that of mere cultivation of given talents from which the concept is derived. So what he's talking about, he says this term of Bildung, this cultivation, this idea that I'm cultivating myself and making me better, build, also carries within it this idea of like nachbild, image copy, vorbild, model. And so this process of build, it's a process, and Bildung, this idea of culture, is this sense of me being formed into the larger whole.
yeah. One of the ways that he says it, I think it's right around in that same paragraph, is he says the thing about Bildung, or culture, is that it's not so much that it's an end, or such, but it is the process itself of going through it. And he draws an amazing parallel between he brings up the Greek term phusis, which is our
Yes.
word for nature. Our word for nature. Now, what's fascinating about this is that he's about to bring up Hegel. Now, what he knows is that Hegel was a kind of Aristotelian. And so what he's talking about with this, now, Aristotle, of course, is the one who gives us the text, the phusis, right? Nature, also the metaphusis, right? Metaphysics. And what essentially it means to have a nature, and why Gadamer brings this up. The word nature itself is definitive of philosophy, because we want to know the natures of things. In other words, things seem to have inner principles of motion, right? And so we use art, techne, to try to model them.
Mm-hmm.
That's where the famous phrase "art imitates nature" comes from. It goes all the way back to Aristotle. Now, Aristotle doesn't say that, but I mean that's how it gets understood. And now so the reason that he's bringing that up is because what we're going to find in the coming pages is that there's also a very important word in Aristotle for what it means for something something's nature to be proper, and that's going to be energeia. In other words,
The energy.
yeah, I mean the way that it gets translated in some by Joe Sachs, and he was also sort of a student kind of Heidegger, which Gadamer was, is being itself, staying itself. In other words, you're performing at your best what you're supposed to be, while still staying at your best, right? So that's that kind of combination of these two things together. And it's just an amazing thing, because that's also, by the way, crucial for Hegel. And Hegel understands himself doing something, and this is why Gadamer is deferring to Hegel in a sense. The word Bildung is crucial for Hegel because it comes up in the Phenomenology of Spirit. It's its own chapter in the middle of the most important chapter of Spirit or Geist, because self-alienation is when the human, with regard to its spirit, recognizes most importantly how to become more human. In other words, how to recognize that which is that makes one human. And now Gadamer is going to go out of his way to say, look, we don't have to accept Hegel's Phenomenology of Spirit or anything to still work within the kind of terms and such that he's given us, because it is rather similar. But that's going to be the key feature about Bildung, is that it's not, and he uses a wonderful example of like a Greek grammar book. You learn the entirety, or as you had mentioned earlier, you absorb, right, the entirety of this text on Greek grammar. But that's not the goal. I mean, it's not just so that you know that text of Greek grammar. No, it's so that you're able to better use or facilitate the grammar itself, or in other words, the language itself, not the grammar. So it's not for the grammar's sake. It's for the language's sake, which ultimately is for your sake, right? So you yourself are in this process of Bildung. It's not so much one that ends as it's this ongoing affair where you are at your best, staying your best, right? That's what's going to be so crucial, because how to even understand of how to get at your best is so fundamentally informed by the tradition from which we come from, right? So
that's right.
So it's,
what's interesting is that when he picks up Hegel's Phenomenology of Spirit, he does so in like 12 and 13 a very specific way. Is he emphasizes formation and picks up on Hegel that the essence of work is to form the thing rather than to consume it. So what Gadamer is doing is he's biasing, in this sense, if you're looking for like the hermeneutical question of how do you interpret the Bible in sense, he's biasing the author over the reader. And so he says work is restrained desire, which is an interesting way to say. So that the essence of work over consumption, right? And so he's talking about work as restrained desire in the terms of like a profession or a craft, right? So for every profession has something about it of fate, of external necessity. It demands that one give oneself to tasks that one would not seek out as a private aim. Practical Bildung is seen in one's fulfilling one's profession wholly in all its aspects. But this includes overcoming the element in it that is alien to the particularity of oneself and making it wholly one's own. Thus, to give oneself to the universality of the profession is at the same time to know how to limit oneself, to make one's profession wholly one's concern. Then it is no longer a limitation. So there's this essence in the saying, like, if you become a pianist or a master woodcarver, you then throw yourself into and we'll get into the notion of the game later, but you throw yourself into the rules of being a pianist, the rules of scales and tonality and notes and all of the way that it's formed, and you submit yourself to the rules that stand outside of you, and then in making them your own and the fullness of your concern, you become no longer limited by your mere particularity. In a sense, you enter into the realm of the master craftsman, the master pianist, and now you can then perhaps, you can create out of this mastery, this formation, this build-up. So he's emphasizing culture as this process by which you accept the rules of the universal, of whatever craft you're engaging in. And in this case, like we're talking about the significance of art. So in a sense, you would submit yourself to sort of the discipline of art, of creation. And in so doing, you then attain something universal. And I think that's kind of, it's a very remarkable way, because he's now placing the origin of the universe on the creator and not the consumer. So the creator is, and then in order to properly grasp what the creator is doing, you then have to, in some ways, go through the same process in order to form yourself, to engage in, to grasp the culture, to be formed by the piece itself. So you then let the author form you, or the pianist form you through his music, or the artist form you through his work.
Yeah. Now here I absolutely have to stop you because I'm going to. I want you to elaborate further on this, because it's so important for people to understand this. Remember, broadly speaking, when Gadamer is going to constantly have reference to and talk about the artwork, he knows, coming from Aristotle, that art, techne, does not necessarily whatsoever mean how we understand it as the fine arts, right? Well, something like, now he does use the example of music and all that, but that's fine. But what he's talking about, art just means something that is, for instance, a text. And the author of that artwork, right, has this meaning they want to get through to us. Now, take everything that you just said a second ago and think about this with respect to the fact of what I mentioned previously, that hermeneutics itself really strides onto the scene. I mean, it goes back all the way, and this is, you find the term itself is Greek. It's in Plato, maybe even earlier. I'd have to double check. It might be in, I'm pretty sure it's also in Homer as well. But the point is this: what is one of the texts that's the most important for so many people? Well, it's the Bible. Now, what is so important about making sure that we know how to understand that text? Well, it's living the pious life. So what does it mean to be formed by the either the tradition or the teaching itself, or how that teaching has been understood? That's going to be, of course, where he's going to place a lot of emphasis on play, in the sense of how the various interpretations of things have come down to us through the tradition. But for your readers, just think about what that means in terms of if the art or the artwork is itself a text, and not just any text, but it's the biblical text, and you are being formed by it. Well, that means that you are doing what you're doing. You are living the teaching of the text. In other words, you have to submit yourself to the process of what the text is telling you is the answer to the good life. I mean, you could do, and I'm speaking of you in particular, Kryptos, you could easily do something like an hour or two just discussion of how all of that applies to and really undergirds just something as what other people think is very simple as prayer, right?
Yeah.
As the process of simply praying, and how doing that is an aspect of submitting yourself. And for your listeners, think about this. This goes back to the notion of culture not being something that's ever really, the notion of culture or Bildung, not what Gadamer is trying to drive home, is that it's not something that's ever completely finished, because you are going through the process. You're trying to reach peak performance in the process while continuing the process. Now think about that with regard to prayer. One does not pray and then that's it. You just go on the rest of your life and never have to pray again. No, this is something that one does on a daily basis. Well, why? Because it is an aspect of the teaching of the good life, according to the artwork, the text of the Bible, that tells us how to be the best, piously, at least with regard to the good life, and stay at that level, right? Because we all know what it's like to, like, have that sort of mic drop moment where we really nailed it, right? When we needed the virtue that's called for in the biblical text the most, we pulled it off, man. We pulled it off. Well, that's great. That's just once. What about an entire life done that way, right? How do you ensure that you're able to make that happen? Well, it's this process, the inner Gaia, we could say, or as Gadamer is saying, the kind of not so much endless task of it, but the fact that it is always in motion. I mean, we don't stay at the peak and then just rest, right? I mean, it's like an athlete or something. You keep doing it. You keep doing it. You
Mhm.
keep doing it so that it's more and more and more natural. And that's exactly why he used that word. He said, Bildung's a lot like the Greek word phusis, nature. Because if you're formed by it enough, right, and you
Mhm.
keep going through the process, then guess what? It just becomes natural. It's like why an athlete practices, right? Think about a football player. They run the same drill over and over and over and over and over again. So then guess what happens on game day when you're surrounded by about, 500,000 people at a university stadium? The ball is in the air, you're on the receiving end of it, and it's nothing for you. You just simply you catch it and you keep running, right? It's not, you don't even think, right? It's just you're doing it, right? You're doing
Yeah.
it. So yeah.
Well, and that that's I mean that's an amazing point, like too, about prayer, that in some sense the formation of reaching up to, in a sense, the ideal of prayer, the sort of aspiring to what you might call the form or the universality of prayer, in a sense, then opens up the possibility of in a sense, I suppose communication with God could happen otherwise, but the process of prayer is, in a sense, part of its essential nature. That the learning of prayer, and it's not the sense that it's completely here, like it's not just like a bottom thing where you never really actually touch with God, but that you actually then, and Gadamer will get into this, the relationship of mystery and symbol and allegory, but there is this sense of how do you then reach God in a way that, like, he makes the case that the argument is that people can actually experience God. And how do you do, and what is, he says that, people have this intuition that I've experienced God. And even if you cannot methodologically observe that, he says it is still, and for the person who has the experience, it's an observable phenomenon. And so you reach that moment where you come close to God, or you meet God, but that aspiration to the universal comes, in a sense, as part of the formation process. What is biblically you would put it this way? How's the verse go? Draw yourself near to God, and He will draw Himself near to you. Right. And there's, in a sense, there's that. And the process of drawing near to God is that process of formation, of build, of recognizing, in the same sense as a craftsman, that you are submitting yourself to the discipline of prayer. And in so submitting yourself, you can become a master prayer. And in becoming a master prayer, you open yourself up to the moment of the production of the content of prayer, which is communion with God in that regard.
Yeah, let me just read the last sentence of the paragraph where this occurs, where he's talking about this, because it's so applicable. Because I want to emphasize that, I mean, look, the stuff that I do in my own recordings and stuff is all pure philosophy. But for your listeners, the whole point of well, not the whole point, but for very, very many of them, the point of even reading Gadamer is the interpretation of text, but not just any text, but the biblical text. And this is what he says. This is how this applies to what we were just talking about. In other words, think about this in terms of prayer or any of the pious Christian virtues. This is what he says. He says, to some extent, everything that is received is absorbed. He said, but in Bildung, what is absorbed is not like a means that has lost its function, but rather it's acquired Bildung. Nothing disappears. He says, but everything is preserved. He says, Bildung is a genuine historical idea, and because of this historical character of preservation, he says it's important for understanding in the human sciences. Now, there's where Gadamer is extending the process. Like we're making it particular for Christians, but Gadamer, of course, that's there. But Gadamer also has the larger philosophical process in mind. But what I would just point out is that's also there's so much of that is that's in many respects that's sort of the brilliance of what Hegel does. Is what Hegel recognizes in the notion of the Aufhebung, or that's the noun of the verb aufheben, which gets translated usually as to sublate or something like this. I hate all the English translations of it, but what it means is that you are first of all you're clasping or grasping something, like with a watch, right? It clasps your wrist. And then it's also preserved at the same time. And so it's that preservation that's going to ultimately be the coming together of these kind of seeming opposites that in the Aufheben, right, the verb of it, or the sublation, that they are preserved and actually go raised to a higher level. So it's that preservation of this culturation process that never just is sort of done or goes away with, but it's preserved within, I guess, what we would just simply call ourself, the self.
And that's why, and Gadamer says that, like, specifically, it's preserved in ourselves. And and then what he does with it then too is he, like 15, he makes that thing. He says, okay, we can take this idea of Bildung, of culture, but we don't need to associate it with the Hegelian notion of absolute spirit or his philosophy of world history. We can just we can just take this idea is good, but we don't need to buy into the whole rest of Hegel for that. Right. And then he moves on to Helmholtz and this notion. So now you've been formed, and he draws in this word tact, right?
Yes.
And begins to talk about tact in terms of memory and perception, right? So this would be like 16 or whatever. He talks about this notion of Bildung, whoever uses his memory as a mere faculty and a technique of memory as such does not yet possess it as something that is absolutely his own. Memory must be formed, for memory is not memory for anything and everything. One has a memory for some things and not for others. One wants to preserve one thing in memory and banish another. It is time to rescue the phenomena of memory from being regarded merely as a psychological faculty and to see it as an essential element of the finite historical being of man. So there is this sense in memory that what you hold in memory is this universal. So if you remember the right things, you are drawing into yourself the universal and are being formed by it. Right. And so then, so then, he talks about this notion of tact, which is the way that in a sense you navigate. Like, how do you know which memories to save and not save? Well, you learn it through the concept of tact. By tact, we understand a special sensitivity and sensitiveness to situations and how to behave in them, for which knowledge from general principles does not suffice. Hence, an essential part of tact is that it is tacit and unformable. One can say something tactfully, but that will always mean that one passes over something tactfully and leaves it unsaid. That it is tactless to express what one can truly pass over. But to pass over something does not mean to avert one's gaze from it, but to keep an eye on it in such a way rather than knock into it, one slips by with it. Thus, tact helps one to preserve distance. It avoids the offensive, the intrusive, the violation of the intimate sphere of a person. So what he's talking about is this notion of like attention and what are you noticing and not noticing. And tact becomes this sense of in it emerges out of your being formed by the culture. And so a cultured person is able to exercise tact in what to notice and not notice. And even though he doesn't notice it, he does notice it, but he chooses not to talk about it and to bring it to consciousness. So there's all of these. And so you're beginning to get a sense that what, in many ways, what Gadamer's doing is, if you think about it in biblical terms, is he's developing a philosophy of biblical wisdom, of this idea of wisdom, in a sense like that passage in Proverbs 26, 4 and 5. How do you choose between whether to educate a fool and correct his folly, or to just ignore his folly and not get sucked into it? Well, for Gadamer, that question gets answered with formation, Bildung, and tact, in that sense that the tactful person knows when to be silent, and the tactful person knows when to make the observation and correct, right? And so this is happening in this formation process. Where is it? And then I've got a couple of big quotes, but so he talks about the universe. This is the bottom of 17. I think we're getting right almost close to the sense of the thing. So this universality is by no means a universality of the concept or understanding. It is not a case of a particular being determined by a universal. Again, this is that kind of modernist, Kantian thing. Nothing is proved conclusively. Now, that's important. The universal viewpoints to which the cultivated man, a bildet, again, he's drawing the word, keeps himself open, are not a fixed applicable yardstick, but are present to him only as the viewpoints of possible others. Thus, the cultivated consciousness has, in fact, the character of a sense. For every sense, the sense of sight, is already universal in that it embraces its sphere, remains open to a particular field, and grasps the distinctions within what is opened to it in this way. In such distinctions are confined to one particular sphere at a time, whereas cultivated consciousness is active in all directions. Such cultivated consciousness surpasses all of the natural science. It is a universal sense. And so here he's basically, and this is where he's sort of asserting the point, is that this cultivated intuition, tact, is superior in the sense of its ability to grasp the truth than is the natural sciences.
Yeah, that's the key. That's the key, because remember how he started is he said, look, the model for the human sciences has been natural science. He says, but that's a bad analogy. That's a bad model, because the human things don't lend themselves to full explanation in the way that the non-human things do by way of natural science. And that's what leads him to this long discussion of culture. Because he's got to find another method, right? If you don't have the method of natural science, well, what do you have? And what he's saying is, look, what about our tradition, right? And what's so definitive of our tradition? Well, it has this Bildung to it, this process of formation, right? That's going to be so crucial. And that's also, I think, why he had mentioned so much that the emphasis on the words that I had brought up earlier, because what he also says in that key passage that you were reading from, he says, because we can't remember everything. We are finite persons, right? We can't. That's why I always tell people there's no such thing as reading. There's only rereading. But then, of course, all the tech bros and everyone like that, they're like, no, that's inefficient. It's like, well, I got news for you, buddy. The human being is inefficient. Okay. So, but this is what he says. He says, when he's talking about forgetting, he says, only by forgetting does the mind have the possibility of total renewal, the capacity to see everything with fresh eyes. See, I mean, can anybody?
It's just layers and layers.
Yeah. I mean, can anybody honestly say, you know what? I read Plato's Republic, and I don't need to do it again because I remember, or in this case, right? Look, I read the book of John. I don't got to go back and read it again. What Gadamer's saying is, he says, look, let's all just at least be honest with ourselves. We read things and we forget them, or other things happen that sort of push them out of our mind or something, and we need to go back so that we can have fresh eyes
Mhm.
for, as he says, not just any kind of renewal, but possibly a total renewal. And he says, so that what is long, this is, I mean, this is everything right here. He says, so that what is long familiar, in other words, our tradition itself,
Mm.
fuses with the new into a many-leveled unity. That's the bridge, right? That's the bridge by which we're able to have the just even the possibility. Now, he's not spelling it out at this point because we've still got a long way to go, but he's saying just to have the possibility of the newness of modernity or something like that with all of our long tradition, that very many aspects of modernity are saying, you know what, we don't even need those anymore. And hey, guess what? You probably can't even know them in the first place. Gadamer is saying, no, that's not true. I mean, and again, we get back to this whole the concept of the title, truth and method, right? That's not true because you're using the wrong method. Effectively, is what he's saying. He's saying if you were more philosophical about the method you take to these texts, then you would realize that it is true that you can renew yourself, fuse this new horizon with the truths from that tradition to
Mm.
begin with. Now, again, he's not going to spell it all out completely because he's just got to go through these next. I mean, we've still got many pages to go where he's saying there's still things that we've all. This is what I love about this opening whole section of Gadamer's. But without telling us, but sort of telling us, he's saying, guys, you've all forgotten your own history. Uh, I've done some heavy lifting for you. I'm not saying I've got it all figured out, but I'm going to remind you of your whole history. And as I'm reminding you of your whole history, you're going to be able to see that very much of the things that you believe today that have done away with your history have in fact done no such thing. And in fact, if you're properly able to remember your own history and tradition, you're going to see that you can, that they are still relevant, and you can still unite
Mhm.
with them for, as he says, a many-leveled unity, right? So there's a unity here. It's multi-layered, whatever that means. But he's going to tell us. But that's going to be this universal hermeneutic that he's working his way towards in the grand scheme
And
of
th-
things.
and this universal, this idea, this thing that binds us together, this is Bildung. And that's the sort of, and he contrasts right at the end of this section, he contrasts this sort of with methodology. That'd be nice, just before he gets to sensus communis, right? But he does so in the dangers of applying method, in a sense, the basically critical theory, critical studies method to the study of scripture and theology, right? So when the methodological ideal of the natural sciences was applied to the credibility of the historical testimonies of scriptural tradition, it inevitably led to completely different results that were catastrophic for Christianity. There's no great distance between the criticism of miracles in the style of the Jansenists and historical criticism of the Bible. Spinoza is a good example of this, and I shall show later that a logically consistent application of this method as the only norm for the truth of the human sciences would amount to their self-annihilation. So he says that, like, basically what was done to the Bible in terms of questioning the miraculous, he says we did to all knowledge through method.
Yeah,
And we can't believe anything anymore. There is no belief anymore. And it just basically nihilism.
let me spell that out for your listeners. This is something I've done in a number of my own recordings on sort of modernity and the rise of modern science. People need to understand Spinoza is the first to apply modern science to the interpretation of the Bible. And in so doing, what he says is I mean, he literally says this, he's explicit. He says, we can't admit miracles. We're not saying that they don't happen, but we can't admit them immediately because it might be the case that we just don't have the science yet that would show that it's not necessarily miraculous. Now, here's the problem with that. The science, and Spinoza knows this, the scientist who says, all right, well, I'm not going to admit the miraculous. I'm just going to keep working away with the scientific tools I have to see if I can further explain the phenomena without recourse to the divine, the
Mhm.
miraculous. Guess what? You're never going to find your way back to the miraculous because you're always, in other words, what Spinoza has effectively done is he has diverted uh, piety with respect to what the divine is capable of.
Mhm.
He's diverted it down this new direction of uh, what is within man's ability to know by way of these new scientific approaches to looking at things.
Well, and it
And
also
so,
dovetails into like not just the miraculous, but people also have to understand the danger of the question. Like I get very, very troubled when people talk about, the Bible is history. Because once you've done that, you are opening yourself up to the like everything in scripture is a historical fact. And once you've done that, you're basically subjecting scripture to the same scientific process. Now, and Gadamer's going to get into the presentation of like, unless it's a videotape, sort of, like the a pure, unvarnished representation of the past, that it ultimately ends up failing. So, Genesis 1, the creation of the world in the way that it's formulated out. And Gadamer is in a sense saying that if you try to address that question scientifically, he says you are asking the wrong question and you end up in the process destroying the biblical record. Because the Bible is, in a sense, it's revealing truth in a way that is formed in sort of its own experience. This is the way that they reveal truth. And so in a sense, you submit yourself to the way in which they are opening up to the truth, and to apply this scientific, set of standards that we have to, historically verify, blah, 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 that you end up undermining. And so people get very, very squirrely about this because they think, well, so does this mean that Jesus didn't live, or that, David wasn't a real king, or God didn't create the world? It's like, no, it's just that by doing so, you are applying a set of criteria that will close you off from the truth of the Bible and will destroy it. And so Gadamer is, in a sense, saying that this methodological approach to something like scripture has to be discarded, and you have to, in this sense, read scripture on its own terms.
yeah, here's the problem with the claim that the Bible is history, is that what most people mean when they say that is that it needs to be verified by this new thing under the sun that we know of as scientific history,
That's right.
objectivity.
Mm-hmm.
The problem with that, though, is that history is not scientific in the same way that the natural sciences are. We call them the natural sciences precisely because we can employ experiments which are they can be repeated, so that we can demonstrate by repetition, yes, this happens. The thing about history is history cannot be repeated, right? So then what it becomes, but keeping in mind it's usually always conflated, so they don't even realize this great difference. They say, well, then we should at least, our science should at least be able to verify that this did in fact occur. Well, here's the problem with that. There's a saying in historiography, which is just the methodological approach to the study of history: absence of evidence is not evidence of absence. So just because you can't find something, that doesn't mean that it wasn't there. It's just
Mm-hmm.
it was in a remote time that, I mean, we can't find it, man. I mean,
Yeah.
it's sort of like saying if your brother comes over and loses your car keys and you can't find them, it's like someone will say, well, you really don't even have a car. It's like, what? what are you talking about, man? So it leads into
Mhm.
all kinds of problems that
Well,
people
and
don't
like
really
you have the
understand.
problem of the synoptic gospels and the differences between them. And well, what about the differences between the accounts of the kingship in Samuel and Kings and then that in Chronicles? What of the two different creation accounts? How do you marry the two different? And so there's all these questions that this idea of scientific history imposes onto the scriptures, and the scriptures are operating from a different sense of, they're in a sense grasping the truth of what happened. And so to
Yeah,
say, like, the truth of what happened is that God created the world in 6 days, right? Wow, what does that mean? You know, and so well, it means that the world was created in 6 days. And so if you try to oppose, well, so for like, I mean, just because I've been steeped in Gadamer and stuff, like I don't even allow the question, right? Because you're asking the wrong question. And your desire to ask the scientific question, did it happen in 6 24-hour days as we know them today, is a sense of you're imposing a set of categories in the text that is basically you're refusing to understand what the text is telling you
yeah.
by
The
asking that
thing that
question.
the thing that frustrates me the most about that is that people people don't realize that the Bible does not present itself as something that we are to open and we look at it and say, "All right, buddy, I don't give me reasons to believe, right? Why are you true?" That's turning it all around. The Bible simply says this is truth. All right. So are you going to
Well, and we
believe
will
it?
get,
Right?
oh, sorry, go ahead.
No,
We'll
no, no.
get into
That's
that. Like Gadamer himself will get into that in the next section when he starts in chapter 2, when he starts talking about play and the notion of play and being played the game. But that's down the road. We have to gather some of these kinds. But that in a sense of, and this is where what Gadamer is, and this is why he's emphasizing production, cultural production, formation, build, as opposed to consumption. So what
right.
Gadamer is saying is that the formation of the text of scripture is more important than your reading of it in that sense, at this point, anyways.
Yeah.
Right. And
Let
so
me let me
at
just
this point, we have to talk about so he's talking about that scripture in that regard emerges and is formed in the history of our own culture. In that the Wirkungsgeschichte.
yeah.
Right. So,
This is what I would say about that is that this is why the whole notion of culture is so important for us going into this. And Gadamer realizes is because uh, it's simply not the case that we have a unified uh, tradition that comes with us. Now there are aspects which are considered to be uh, more acceptable. They have won the day or something like that. But there are entire different schools of interpretation of artwork, right? Whatever this
oh
thing
yeah.
that we call the work of art is. And so now we are in the position of having to decide which one that we find most persuasive or that we were born into as our family, like that were handed down to us from our father. Said, like for instance, like no, you're not born a Catholic, son. We over here we are Protestants or something like this, right? So there's that aspect, but then there's also going to be this element. But those different interpretations of things is exactly what's Gadamer's concerned with regard to the kind of the sort of the play of interpretation of how these things get handed down to us. But then in addition to that, there's also that sort of what I had mentioned previously, the other element that we just can't really put a logos to it, but we have this sense of a kind of call of conscience that allows us a kind of freedom in making choices among the different things that we see that are our tradition, right? Uh, of the present moment, going into the future of possibilities, or the possibilities for the future that we're going to
Mhm.
make decisions about and everything like that. And so that's again, that's just all of this is I find invaluably helpful because for thoughtful people, if we're honest, things are not as simple as we would like to very often sort of say they are, right? And this
And
is what,
that's the attraction of method, is
yeah,
is that you have a nice, neat, simple avenue to truth. And Gadamer is like,
simplification,
yeah,
right?
no, let's talk about that.
Exactly,
Right.
exactly,
Well,
yeah.
and then we get into like sensus communis, right? And again, you begin with Vico's De Nostre Temporis Studorium Ratione, right? And that's the work that he draws from. But what's interesting is, again, it's the way that he draws from Vico. He appeals to sensus communis, common sense, and to the humanistic ideal of eloquence, elements already present in the classical concept of wisdom. Interesting, right? So in this sense, for those that would think too, is that if you want to come up with a category or to say a label for, say, scripture, and what would be the one label to put it under, the correct label would be wisdom and not history. Okay. And if you want to get into the sense of like scripture as wisdom literature, even the law, the letter, all of wisdom, then you're getting closer to the sense of like, what is the text trying to do? And that allows you, in a sense, the avenue into which, when Gadamer begins to allay it. So he talks about elements already present in the classical concept of wisdom. Talking well has always had two meanings. It's not merely a rhetorical idea. It also means saying the right thing, the truth, and is not just the art of speaking, of saying something well. So you have this combination of two things. Okay, you want me to hit pause then, eh?
No, I was letting you know, I sent you a text. Unfortunately, because it is Thanksgiving,
we have to wrap it up.
I've got to wrap it up here in a second. Because I've got.
Do you want to keep on, or do you want me just to cut off there, and we'll pick up sensus communis the next time?
Let's pick up sensus communis the next time, because
I have
revelers. There are revelers here. They're all looking at me.
Okay, then what I will do then is I will maybe nip it in the bud, or maybe I'll leave it, and we'll just wish everybody a happy Thanksgiving, and we'll leave that as a teaser for the next time. And okay, very good. Thank you, Athenian. So we got through 19 pages. There we go. Or we're on page 19. I think we got through like 6 pages. There we go.
Yeah.
So
yeah.
At this rate, we'll be doing this when we're 100.
Listen, thank you so much. Only because it was a holiday, I had to draw things a little shorter here, but we'll be able to do our much more encompassing next time for sure. So
very good. Yeah, we'll do the 4-hour masterpiece next time. All right.
Have a great one, brother.
You too. We'll talk to you later, my friend.
Okay. Bye-bye.